and exactly the time to say the wheel starts. We'll be starting now. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrea Verdel, and welcome to the second On Think Tank's School webinar series of 2019. I don't know if we'll be recording this, so Eva, please, if you can, no, sorry, I can just, you can start the recording. And so last week we had Gala Diaz from CPEC speaking about new challenges for think tanks. And next week we'll have Tom Hashemi, who will present the latest research exploring the UK public's attitudes towards policy-driven organizations, including think tanks. So please see our full webinar list, which we'll continue to update, and do also join us on the next one. Today, we're honored to have Ruth Levine, who is the Program Director of Global Development and Population at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And since 2011, she has led the foundation's team responsible for grant making to improve living conditions in low and middle income countries, as well as reproductive health rights. She's also worked at USAID and spent almost 10 years at the Center for Global Development. She's a development economist and an expert in global health, education, and evaluation. And she's the author of many books and publications, many of which I've read, well, not many, but I've read a couple. And I really invite you to explore them as well. She's an inspiring speaker, and I'm really happy to have her with us today. And with this extensive experience and knowledge, Ruth will give a very interesting presentation discussing ways in which think tanks can successfully engage with funders. I see that many of you have joined. When you do join, please mute your microphones. We have a chat box, which I see some of you are already using, and use that if you want to ask any questions. The webinar will last 45 minutes. The first 20 will be devoted, 15 to 20 will be devoted to Ruth's presentation. And if you have any questions throughout this the presentation, please write them in the chat box, and I will give them to Ruth when the presentation is done. Then we'll have around a 25-minute Q&A session, and which will pass these questions. I've also noted some of the questions that you wrote when you registered for the webinar. And if by some reason we don't have time to address all of your questions, we can continue this conversation online. We can do that on Twitter. We have a Twitter account, and I'm sure we can continue chatting with her on think tanks. And so we can, this is not just the end, this is the start of a bigger conversation. So I'm happy that you're here, and without further delay, please help me welcome Ruth.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Really, really excited to be here. I am a huge fan of the work of On Think Tanks, and am really delighted to be able to share some ideas. Just wanted to check to make sure that you can hear me well. Okay, great. Excellent. So thanks to everybody for taking time, whatever time zone you're in, to participate in a conversation about the important question of how think tanks can engage in the most successful way with foundation funders. And maybe this, what I'll talk about today, extends to other kinds of funders, but I have a particular kind of perspective from my role at the Hewlett Foundation. So as Andrea mentioned, I used to work at a think tank, the Center for Global Development, and actually long, long ago at another think tank, the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. And when I was at the Center for Global Development, I worked with lots and lots of US foundations, the Hewlett Foundation, the Packard Foundation, MacArthur, Rockefeller, and the Gates Foundation. And from all those interactions, I learned a lot about how to relate to these mysterious beasts upon which our lives were dependent, or at least our professional lives. But then I had the opportunity about 8 years ago to come and be the director of the Global Development and Population Program at the Hewlett Foundation. And so now I have an inside perspective. And the Hewlett Foundation is particularly, I think that perspective is useful for think tanks because we at the Hewlett Foundation are so committed to bringing evidence to bear on key policy questions in the US and internationally. And think tanks are major partners of ours, and we have been one of the key supporters of the Think Tank Initiative, as well as on think tanks. So perhaps the perspective that I bring can be useful. I certainly hope so. So in preparing for this webinar, I thought to myself, well, what would the me of many years ago when I was at the Center for Global Development have liked to know about the inner workings of the foundations with which we were working or trying to work. And so that's the sort of content that I'm hoping to share today. Let me first just kind of make sure we're all on the same page about how most, probably not all, but most foundations are organized internally. So most foundations have a kind of cadre of professionals called program officers. And those are the people who are, in general, responsible for identifying potential grantee organizations, doing due diligence, interacting around proposals, and making recommendations for funding, or making recommendations not to fund. Those are, in, I would guess, all cases, recommendations. So the program officers themselves are not, they're making decisions about what to recommend, but they're not ultimately making the final decision about what to fund, how long the grant should be, the size of the grant, and other key questions. I've found that sometimes this is confusing because prospective grantees, grant seekers, tend to interact largely with the program officers, and they don't see what's going on behind the scenes. And behind the scenes, in different foundations, there are multiple layers of decision makers who the program officers generally have to inform and convince about the value of the recommendations to fund. So anytime a grant is approved, it's because not only that's what the program officer thought was a good idea, but what some number of people, and it can be many people, back at headquarters thought was a good idea. So that might be useful to keep in mind. Let me offer 3 points that I would have wanted to really understand way back when I was writing, when I was trying to figure out who to go to for funding and how to get it as a think tank leader. Well, think tank senior staffer at the Center for Global Development. The first and possibly the most important is that strategic alignment is crucial. And what's useful to keep in mind is that pretty much every foundation has some sort of strategy that articulates and constrains what it is interested in funding. Those are often oriented toward particular geographies or particular sectors, but they are more than that. They reflect how the foundation believes that philanthropic dollars can make a material and important difference in some set of goals that they are setting out to work on. So for example, at the Hewlett Foundation, one big area of work is around transparency, participation, and accountability. That doesn't mean we fund every single thing that could possibly be called, could be related to public sector transparency or citizen participation or government responsiveness and accountability. We have laid out, and it's in multiple documents, we have laid out a particular set of ideas about where we think we can make the biggest difference and the kinds of work that we are seeking to support. It's really important that any grant seeker use that information to understand where the organization is coming from and what they are likely to respond to and what kinds of work they're likely to support. What I have found from my perspective here is that many grant seekers kind of do the most superficial reading of the strategies, and they just look for keywords that possibly could be related to their work, and use that as the entry point and say, well, we do work on, say, transparency, and so you might be interested in funding us. I would say that is not a very successful approach, and it is much better to really understand as much as possible what the underlying ideas are in the strategy, and then use those to see whether the work you do is actually aligned. And that gets me to the work you do. So when I was at the Center for Global Development, I am not sure I really understood what funders were asking when they said, well, what is your organizational strategy, and what are the organizational assets that you bring to achieving that strategy? Different organizations have different ways of articulating what they do and how they do it. What I strongly recommend is that the leadership of think tanks spend quite a bit of time trying to come up with ways to really authentically describe who they are, what their underlying mission is, why they think their work can achieve that mission. Spending time working on that means that you will have the answer to the question, what's your strategy, when a funder asks. And I will also say that it is not a good idea when somebody says, when a potential funder says, what's your strategy, to hand them your strategic plan. Or only to hand them your strategic plan. Strategic plans tend to be written appropriately, actually, for insiders. They tend to be long, they are often filled with jargon, and program officers do not, in general, like to read lots and lots of strategic plans. What they'd rather do is hear a kind of short, easy to understand description of, again, what your mission is, who you are, what you're trying to achieve, how you think you can do it, why you think you're well positioned to do it. Okay, so that is a few words about strategic alignment. Super important to be able to demonstrate understanding of the foundation strategy, or at least curiosity about it, and to be able to articulate your own strategy, because that's where you can figure out, is there an overlap in those two things where it's clear that you have the right funder for the right organization. Okay, second point is that most funders want a relationship, not only a transaction. One of the maybe not so great features of being at a foundation that program officers and program directors and other program staff experience is that people look at them as sources of money. And sometimes they only look at them as sources of money. And that is not actually a very good feeling. What the most successful grant seekers do is establish a relationship with the program staff as fellow professionals working in the same fields, as people who are interesting to talk to and who might be interested in what you have to say, people who want to bounce ideas around, want to have a genuine kind of conversation and relationship, the same way you would with maybe peers and other think tanks. Foundations like the Hewlett Foundation and many, many others that fund think tanks or other organizations that do policy related research are quite sophisticated professionals. They come from the fields in which they are working, and they want to have conversations about content. They don't want to be looked at as a as a checkbook. So how to do that? I've given some kind of general advice about the kinds of content you might try to have conversations about. And I would just suggest that, again, thinking back to my former role, just say that if you feel like you are in a kind of sales mode, trying to convince somebody that you can do things that you know in your heart you cannot do, or only sort of talking about how great your organization is, then I think you should kind of pull back, reflect a little bit, and say, how could I approach this conversation in a different way? Again, in a way I would do with, with a peer in my field. Okay, so that's the second bit of advice. And the third bit of advice is that you can always ask for what you need. That might be for more money, it might be for more time, it might be for an introduction to another funder, or simply for information about the direction of the foundation's strategy or funding. I know lots of funders are very inflexible about things like, for example, what % of a project can be, what % overhead or indirect cost you can charge for a project. And it may seem like many foundations are inflexible about timing, like we can only give 1-year grants. Okay, so it is possible that those inflexibilities are real. But you can always, always ask in a tactful way, in a patient way. But I think that you have the responsibility and can take advantage of opportunities to ask the program staff with whom you are connected about how flexible they might be in service of the success of the project that they are funding, or the organization that they are funding. You might find, to your surprise, that there is much more flexibility than you assume. And simply by asking questions about, well, could we get a no-cost extension if the data collection is slow? Or could you introduce us to other funders who work in the same area? Or would it be possible to put more of the institutional costs as a direct cost for the project rather than indirect, because for the success we actually need to be able to cover full costs? You can always ask those questions. There's a possibility that the program staff will say, no, I'm sorry, we have no flexibility. But then you're just in the same place you are now. And you will have raised awareness among the people who actually also want you to succeed, that there are some constraints that they have imposed that may limit that success. So that is the third point, is that you actually are not kind of powerless and in a kind of supplicant role. You are part of a team, the funder and the people who are doing the work, who are trying to achieve a common goal. And you can, and I think, have the responsibility to ask for what you need. So those are 3 quite commonsensical, but still often not used enough bits of advice. I'll just repeat the key points. 1 is pay attention to strategic alignment and be prepared in any interaction with a program officer or other representative of a foundation to be able to demonstrate understanding of their strategies to the extent they've made it public, and to be able to clearly state your own organizational or project-specific strategy. That's number 1. Number 2 is build a relationship and don't focus on the money, or certainly don't focus on that exclusively. And 3rd, ask for what you need. And be prepared, of course, to hear no. We can't make your life better in terms of more money or more time or other forms of flexibility. But I would say, be clear about what you need to succeed, again, in this kind of shared ambition of success. So with that, I will close my kind of opening remarks and really look forward to hearing your questions and comments. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Andrea to moderate.
Sorry, great. Thank you, Ruth. That was really interesting. I was busily typing everything that you've said. Thank you for that. I have some questions that people have asked when they sign up to the webinar. But please, if you are here right now, type your questions on the chat box on the right, and we'll feed them to Ruth. So one of the things that someone has asked is, so how to find out what kind of budget we should pitch for, not too low or not too high? Do you want me to give you a couple and then you can see how you put them together, or?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah.
Then there's another one, and I think that builds on maintaining a relationship, is how to build rapport with the funder, and then how to persuade them or convince that your idea is good for funding. So those are three from people, and I have one myself. So how do the relationships differ based on the funder? You've mentioned you've been at the Hewlett Foundation. So would this suggestions work both for any kind of funder, or do you have specific suggestions for each kind of funder?
Great. Okay. So let me tackle these important questions. So the first about how do you know what budget to ask for? So I'll, let's see, I'll approach this in a couple of ways. First of all, with the information that you have without necessarily any knowledge of the particular funder, you will know, I think, because you certainly will know from lots of Unthink Tanks resources and other knowledge that you have, how to do appropriate costing of a project. So if you want to do a particular research project that has data collection, it has analytic work, it has dissemination, and it has follow-up with policy engagement, you should be able to cost that out, and you'll know how much it costs to do that work successfully. I can anticipate some questions that are coming up, but let me just pursue this line of thought. So that's for a project. If what you're seeking, and most people are seeking, institutional support of some kind, then I think you have to really think through, from your own organizational perspective, how dependent do you want to be on any one funder? And I strongly advise that, except in cases of extreme emergency, you do not want to be dependent on any single funder for more than 20% of your organizational budget. When you are in a very, very vulnerable place. And I am sure that organizations that have that experience will know what I'm talking about. So that's sort of how to think about the size of a budget, simply without sort of worrying about any particular funder. So now let's think about the information that you can get from funders about how much you can ask them for. Several sources of information. First of all, many funders actually have on their website the information about grants that they have given, and you will be able to see from that if you do your research. And everybody's a researcher here, so you know how to do this. If you do your research on the previous grants, you'll see what the range is, and some funders helpfully tell you what the average size of a grant is. So that gives you kind of an anchor to think, well, okay, if the Hewlett Foundation often gives, $500,000 grants, then I'm not going to ask them for a $25,000 grant, and I'm also not going to ask them for a $5 million grant. So it kind of helps anchor. So there's data to use there. And then this is also another thing where you can ask. It is possible that your program officer will not give you that information for whatever crazy reason, but you can ask, and I think you should ask so that nobody wastes their time with a grant that is wildly outside the bounds of what's possible. One more thought about the budget is that the way we often like to get budgets is what I think of as modular. So you can say, well, foundation, if you could provide $100,000, we could do this project. If you could provide $200,000, we could do this project plus a whole lot of follow-up or plus a larger data collection effort. If you could provide $500,000, we could do 3 related projects and create a body of work. So I don't want to belabor the point, but that is one way, and often a very effective way, to help the program officer understand what is and is not possible for a small amount of money, and then what exciting things they could get if they could mobilize more resources. Okay, I'll try to be quicker with the other responses. Is it okay? All right. Okay. Now, a couple about relationships. So one, I'll take the last one first, about the relationship with different kinds of organizations. So, or funders. Yeah, every funder is special in their own way. I would say for foundations, the advice that I've given about trying to build rapport and establish kind of peer professional relationship is the right way to go. And I'll get to how to build that rapport in a moment. With a funder that is required to do public procurement, so that would include USAID. I think it also includes the UK Department for International Development. I think also the European Union, a number of other essentially public sector funders, because they are required to do open bidding. The role of building rapport is less, but not zero. I think that it is well known that that there is some subjectivity in decisions about who to fund. It's not all some kind of formula that the procurement division does. And so some relationship building with, say, the in-country staff at USAID to better understand the strategies, better understand what they might be looking for in future procurements is a good idea. I think the payoff is not as significant. It's not as crucial, I would say, as with foundation funders. You might want to invite somebody from one of those agencies to speak about this topic. My experience at USAID was both short, and also I wasn't responsible for any funding decisions like these. Okay, so how do you build rapport? Well, you build rapport with program staff pretty much the way you build rapport with anybody. Asking questions about themselves, their own background, what's exciting to them about their work, about the strategy, telling them interesting stories about your work rather than some kind of boilerplate recitation of your CV. I mean, just like the way you would, again, I can't think of anything better, a better analogy than like if you were meeting a peer at a conference or something and you found them interesting, you'd start a conversation about sort of work that's exciting to you. You'd want to hear about work that's exciting to them, share ideas. Maybe you'd throw in a little bit of oblique, not criticism of their work, but just like an interesting observation about how they might think about their work a little bit differently. You know, program staff at foundations are just so accustomed to hearing nothing but like, oh, that's a great idea. Wow, you're really exciting to talk to. And they have their guard up about that. They feel like that is part of the sales job and part of being seen as just the route to money. And so having a really authentic kind of conversation is something that is quite rare and hugely appreciated. One more point on this that I forgot to mention when I was talking about how foundations organize their work. One real difference across foundations is the number of grantees that any program officer is responsible for. So in some foundations, they have like a program officer will have like 5 grantees. And in others, they'll have 30. And in still others, they'll have 100. So early on, when you encounter a program officer, asking them, how many organizations do you interact with? Do you have grant-making relationships with? Can give you a lot of information about how hassled that person is, how stretched he or she is. If they are dealing only with 5 organizations, first of all, I would say beware of that arrangement, because that will mean they will be very, very involved in your work, likely. So be prepared for that. But if they only have 5 organizations, they might have all kinds of time to read your strategic plan. If they are working with 100 organizations, they are still just one person, and they do not have time to read your strategic plan. They need you to be very, very sharp and crisp with your communication. So that is, I will say that if there's one question that you might want to have early on in your conversations with a new program officer you're meeting, it is that question of like, how many grantees are you working with? And then to be sympathetic when they say, oh my gosh, I have 100 grantees. Then that will instantly start a conversation about, oh my goodness, how do you do that work? How do you balance your workload? That is building rapport. And then, wow, the question about how do you persuade?
Can
Yeah.
there have been asked a couple of questions relating to relationships. So before going to the persuasion,
Sure.
so I have a couple of comments. So one is establishing contacts with funders that do not launch calls. And another one is how, in maintaining a relationship, how does seniority play in? And what is it solely the director's role, or should it be organizational wide? Is it better looked upon by senior staff? So who should be involved in that? And can you do this by email, and not if you can't do it face to face?
Yeah. Okay.
You don't have to address them all, but
Yeah. So for foundations that don't do open calls, and we've started to do more open calls here, but it's very, very, very time consuming, and it also is not often an efficient use of the time of lots of organizations who then aren't going to get money. I think there are a few key ways. So one is try to find these people at conferences. Everybody goes to meetings, program officers included. Try to find them there and ask if they have time for a 5 or 10 minute conversation. That is why program officers go to conferences, is to meet people. So that's one way. Another way is to find through LinkedIn or other sources people who know people. And get an introduction. That often happens is that somebody who knows a person at a foundation will introduce a grant seeker, and that is a way to get on the radar. And then sorry. And then another way is to ask for a meeting, and this is often done through email, so I'll now do the email part. So it is definitely possible to reach program staff through email. I think here is where really it's most important to have done your homework and understand as much as you can through publicly available sources what that funder is interested in. Because we all, I'm sure of this, we all have kind of boilerplate responses to emails from people we haven't heard from who are just asking for money. They say, I see you fund in Africa. I am an African institution. When can we talk? So that's not successful. That will not be successful. If somebody writes and says, I see you fund in Africa in this particular area, in this particular way, and that you have funded organizations like this, I am a peer of those organizations doing this kind of work that closely aligns. Can we talk? Much more successful. So that's my advice on, okay. And then senior staff. Well, so I think this may vary from foundation to foundation. At the Hewlett Foundation, the people we are most excited about talking to are the people who are doing the work and who are most knowledgeable about the work that we might be interested in funding. Sometimes that is the senior leadership, but most of the time I would say it is somebody in a research position who can speak to why he or she is super excited about the opportunity, what they're going to do, who they're connected to in government or in other communities that ultimately the research is intended to serve. Again, I think it's possible that other foundations are a little more attentive to positional authority. Okay, that's what I have to say about those questions.
And I cut you before you were going to address the last one, I think, on...
Yeah, so how do you persuade, for that, I could go on, and I think that the more efficient way is maybe after this call, you could circulate, I've done a couple of blog posts that are, one is called Pitch Imperfect, How Not to Approach a Foundation for Funding. And sometimes it's useful to know what's going to fail. So that's a list of things that are going to fail. And the other is Pitch Persuasive, How Maybe to Be Successful in Getting Funding. So I can send those links and maybe you can post them.
Okay, great, we'll do so. Okay. And so I had another one, so I'll use my moderator privileges. And so how should think tanks maintain their independence in engaging with funders? So it's important to align, but how you maintain your research priorities, your methods, and how to maintain that balance with what you want, what they want, and what the work needs to be done.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, and so important for everybody, and particularly I think for the think tank community, where independence is one of the key assets. You do not want to be the kind of researchers for hire where the results and conclusions are predetermined by the funder, and it's just your job to put your institutional reputation on the line and publish something that is, that the funder wants you to publish. So really, really important. A couple of points on that. One is getting back to how much of your organizational budget you want to be attached to any one funder. That's why I say less than 20% or less, because you have, well, I think it's obvious how much your independence may be compromised by significantly more dependence on any single funder. I also think that it's important for think tanks to have public statements on their website and in their materials about their institutional policies with regard to the influence of funders. I don't think all think tanks currently have this. It's a relatively easy kind of statement to make. And there are lots of good examples. So I think putting out there in public and then having that associated with any proposal materials is a sign that you really care about this. And then the third is maybe the most important, which is to really know thyself, know your organization, what your mission is, how much you are willing to institutionally to adapt your priorities to funding opportunities. That is a core leadership job. Nobody else can do that for you. And it is, I think, crucial to have those conversations among the senior leadership before a particular opportunity emerges. So once and then on an ongoing basis, I think really having a conversation among the senior leadership of about how far you would stretch for a funding opportunity. And that can be in the context of preparing that public statement about your commitment to your own intellectual independence.
Great, thanks. That's all very interesting and useful. I'll use that on for the future for writing. And we are almost out of time. I have two more questions. I'll pose both to you, and if we only have time for one, so choose one, and the rest will continue online. And we've just shared the blogs that you mentioned, and we'll also be sharing the recording of the webinar, so for everyone to know, and we'll be posting the links there. And so the last two questions are, one is how to, and if you get refused, and I think this relates to what you said, don't be afraid to ask, can you send the second application if you've been said no? And do you know, the other one is, do you know anything about the European funders? And do you know if there's a difference between US and European funders?
Yeah, okay. Yes, you can absolutely apply or inquire about funding if you've been refused. I think it makes sense to invite any feedback so that you can understand why your original request has been refused, whether it's lack of strategic alignment, or that the budget was out of scale, or some other reason, because you just don't want to waste anybody's time. And you don't have an infinite number of kind of opportunities, right? You can't be the one who comes back again and again with some slight variant of the same idea that didn't get funded before. So you really want to get as much information as you can about why you were refused in the first place, and then use that to inform a second or subsequent attempt. They're often, I'd also keep an eye on when there are leadership or other personnel changes at the foundation, and then give it a few months, and then potentially approach again with an idea that's informed again by the previous feedback. There's no question that personnel changes do, at least at the margins, affect the work that foundations do, because a lot of it is, as you've picked up from my comments and experience, there's a lot of discretion involved in these recommendations for funding. And the second question about European funders, I know a little bit. We have some funding relationships. And when I was at CGD, we got some support from European funders. On balance, there's less philanthropic, significantly less philanthropic money available, many fewer foundations. This is because the Europeans know how to have a decent tax regime and provide social welfare, kind of have a social welfare framework. We do not in the United States know how to do that. So our taxes are way out of whack. And there's the greater potential for accumulation of wealth and then tax benefits for philanthropic spending on things that in general governments ought to be spending on. That's my editorial comment. But there's less money and fewer foundations, less activity. That said, there are certainly some European foundations that I think operate similarly to US foundations, and some that are even run by Americans, and they just happen to be in Europe.
Well, with that, thank you. We've reached the time, and so just to be conscious of everybody, and thank you very much for this. We can continue this online. We continue about the European funders and relationships. So there's a lot of things that we can continue talking on. Thank you again for being with us. This has been really interesting for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. And we'll continue seeing each other. And thank you for everything.
Great, and I'll see everybody on Twitter.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.